Welcome back to the show, Indestructible Souls. I am your host, Jonathan Beauregard of Indestructible Souls. It is August 14th, and we're back for a new episode. I want to thank everybody for their continued success and continuing to support the podcast and all of the positive feedback. It is greatly appreciated. I am still looking for some guests who are brave enough to come on the show and talk about various things. So if you ever want to be a guest on the show, please reach out to me. You can reach me at jonathan@beauregardtherapy.com. And, let's talk about anything that represents or the embetterment of Black men, Black boys. And yet again, this is Jonathan Beauregard. I am your host. And before we get started, I want to just remind you that I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and you can find me at Beauregard Therapy, at beauregardtherapy.com. And my computer is acting up, but we'll get it together. And then also, you could check out the podcast on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and I believe that's it. So today, I want to talk about something that's really important, particularly for all kids, but I'm going to focus a lot on African-American boys since school's back in session. As a therapist, I'm already getting requests or new referrals to work with kids, particularly school-age kids, to deal with the age-old ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So why would I do a show on ADHD? Well, the title of the show for today is it ADHD or not? Why is that important for us to talk about? Is it ADHD or not? Well, here's the reason why. So for many years, I've worked with school-age kids. I worked with teens, young adults, and so forth. But particularly, I'm going to talk today about working with school-age kids. And why, particularly for Black boys, talking about is it ADHD or not is so important is because oftentimes we're overdiagnosed if it's whether it's ADHD or not. And a lot of things look like ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I'm going to break that down for you in a minute. But oftentimes when our kids do legit have ADHD, but we'll get into that, it's often classified as a behavior disorder or a behavioral problem. Not a disorder, but a behavioral problem. So legitly, when kids need interventions to deal with their hyperactivity or being inattentive, there's various reasons why. However, for our kids, it's a proven fact that more often than not is seen as a behavioral problem, which means they don't receive services, accommodations, or assistance with the disorder of ADHD, but oftentimes they're sent to the principal's office and being considered for suspension, expulsion, being stigmatized as classroom disruptive to the classroom and all of those things. So that's one caveat and one aspect of it. But the other thing is where I really want to break this down and we get into is it ADHD or not is because oftentimes when kids are misdiagnosed, obviously they're going to be the treatment interventions will not be effective because we're not treating the right thing. And so now that school's back in session, I figured this would be a good time to talk about what is ADHD? And I don't want to be too technical or too clinical, but I'll break it down as simple as possible. Not that it's a difficult concept or anything, but I don't want to, talk about all the clinical terms that we generally use in the field. Now, why is this so important? A lot of times I have parents come to me, and I'm pretty sure other therapists have the same experience. And oftentimes by the time they come to therapy, here's what happens. They already have what we call, they're already labeled as disruptive in the classroom. Let's start there. So that's one issue. Then the other issue is they're stigmatized and they begin to fall behind academically. Remember, is it ADHD or not? So what happens is they start to fall behind in class. They're being labeled as a behavioral problem, but the services that they're getting aren't matching what's really taking place. Here's what I mean by that. By the time they come, sometimes they've been tested for a learning disability or not. Sometimes they've been placed on what we call a 504 plan or an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. And here's the difference. In order to qualify for an IEP is that there has to be some type of learning disability, processing disorder, or whatever it may be. So that's more biological and so forth. A 504 plan is more for what they consider a behavioral or medical problem. Whereas they don't necessarily believe, or your kid hasn't tested to have a learning disability, but it's more of a medical, biological condition that with accommodations, the kid can still thrive in school. Now, by the time they come to me, what's happened is they've been labeled as ADHD, or we have parents that have sort of run out of resources, and then the medical doctor and or the school psychologist or whatever says this kid needs therapy. Okay. And go take him to a therapist and figure out if he has ADHD. And sometimes the primary physician says he has ADHD based off of what parents are telling him. Now, so the reason why this question is so important, is it ADHD or not? For one, there are some clear factors that's going to determine if a kid has ADHD or not. And then there's going to be some other factors that's not so clear. Here's the key point. That's not so clear that your child may look like they have ADHD. The behaviors may be very similar to ADHD, but the reality is that if the symptoms are treated and the conditions are treated, then the symptoms of ADHD goes away. And I want to caution parents to not stigmatize your children. For one, that, oh, my child has ADHD, because then there's some consequences that come with that. And then the next thing that comes is considering medication. And what happens is once your kid goes on medication, understand there's other side effects. There's the illusion that the medication is going to cure the ADHD. Here's the problem. If your child does not have ADHD and there's other factors that's causing their behavior to mimic ADHD, then we're treating the wrong thing. So let's get into it real quick. So what is ADHD? So let me explain it and just really, really briefly. And this is going to be really important to understand. So, what is ADHD? Basically, when we talk about the behavior, so I'm going to explain it in two ways. So, ADHD is basically a condition or a disorder where someone has a hard time paying attention, sitting still, concentrating, focusing, and so forth. And so what happens is it is a disorder that affects a person's ability to pay attention, to have impulse control within their behaviors, right? Now, there's some hard facts when we talk about what causes ADHD. So let me explain the ADHD. So back in the day, they used to call it either ADHD or ADD. So now there's three types of ADHD. So we don't use ADD no more. So it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and there's either two types. One is there's an inattentive type, right? Which means a person struggles to pay attention, right? So what does that look like? Struggle to pay attention, difficulty following through on task, which means you give them a task to do, they can't complete it because their mind's just easily distracted and off in various places. Often forget to take care of their responsibilities. You tell your child to go, get their backpack. By the time they go to get their backpack, they're off doing something else. Sometimes people make careless mistakes because the ability to stay focused is impaired. Disorganized and often loses things. Those are some brief, if you will, examples of being inattentive. So you can have ADHD and not be hyperactive and only have ADHD inattentive. The other part of that is ADHD hyperactive. Some kids can be hyperactive, but could pay attention very well. So what does the hyperactivity behavior look like? Difficulty sitting still, constantly fidgeting, often restless, difficulty waiting their turn, just impatient, lack focus, overly talkative, disrupt others, and so forth. So understand 1 in 10 kids are diagnosed with ADHD. So you can have an attentive type, hyperactive type, or you can have what we call a combined type, meaning you have both are present at the same time. Now, that's what ADHD looks like. Those are the things that we test for, especially in childhood. Oftentimes, ADHD peaks at about age 7 or 8. As kids begin to mature, the ADHD, if they truly have ADHD, then not to say that it goes away. However, as kids mature and learn skills, or people mature and learn skills to manage their ADHD, then it's not so noticeable. So real quick, let's talk about what causes it. Here's why this is important. And I'm going to get to why this is so important. So when we talk about what causes ADHD, there's various things that causes a clinical diagnosable form of ADHD. And I'm going to get to why this is always questionable when kids come to me or I don't know how other therapists deal with it, but when a child comes to me and the parent says, my child has ADHD, I assess not only the child, I assess the parent, and I also assess the conditions that they grew up in and their environment, the school, whatever it may be. I'm not just taking the fact that the kid doesn't pay attention as they have ADHD. So here's some hard facts about what causes ADHD, right? So one of the things that we know is that, and we saw this obviously in the 80s and with the drug epidemic and so forth, is mothers who use alcohol or drugs during pregnancy. And we know the travesty of how the crack epidemic affected not only the mothers, but it affected babies. Then we got this term crack baby and so forth. So I could do a whole show on that, but I won't, at least not at this time. So we know that in utero, if there's a disruption to the pregnancy through drugs and alcohol and trauma in utero, that it can cause ADHD. So then we talk about being exposed to lead, right? Premature pregnancy, malnourishment. We're gonna talk about that. A diet, check this out, a diet rich in additives and preservatives, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other sensory disorders. Meaning, when we talk about sensory disorders, other biological disorders or processing disorders that creates other issues. Here's the other thing, genetics. If a parent has ADHD or has been diagnosed with ADHD, a child is 50% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. So we know that this is also can be genetic and hereditary. So when we get into all the brain chemistry and all that stuff, okay. So there are some hard facts of some things that we know that causes ADHD. Now, real quick, so you parents may know, what does it look like in girls versus what it looks like in boys? So here's the thing. Boy symptoms are often more external, which means we can see it in the behavior, and girl symptoms of ADHD is often internal. So one of the things that we see in boys, and this is why boys get in trouble in school, is because of being impulsive. But a lot of times we call it acting out. So kids being impulsive. The hyperactive, running around, hitting each other, turning flips, all of these things. So then, because of the behavior, we see the hyperactivity, lack of focus, poor concentration, not able to stay focused, and so forth. And then oftentimes, we see physical aggression. Now, what does it look like in girls? So girls are more withdrawn. They have low self-esteem, more anxiety, have difficulty paying attention, struggle academically, inattentive, daydreaming, zoning out, that sort of thing, and can become verbally aggressive. Now, let me tell you a story real quick. So just real quick, when I was working with teens and or children, one of the things that we, like I said before, we in a different podcast, when I worked with kids, we would go into the homes, we would go into the schools, and all of these things. So I had this family that I was working with, and I was working with practically half the family, the little 3-year-old, I think it was the 7-8-year-old brother, and then the teenage daughter. And she was about 14, 15. And they were all diagnosed ADHD. But however, the 14-year-old came to me for depression. Now check this out. So she came to me for symptoms of depression, just like I said before, low self-esteem, anxiety, withdrawn, and so forth. And she struggled academically. But when I would sit down with her, and I would even sit and do her homework, help her with her homework and all these other things. And when you sit down, you can see, oh, she can read, she can comprehend. So what's really going on? What's going on with this depression? Which was the low self-esteem, which was the negative thoughts and all of these things. Worked with her and the family for months. I forget how long. And I noticed as we would be talking and, doing these different interventions, I could be sitting there having a conversation with her, and all of a sudden, she didn't know what I was talking about. Now, was she being rude and not listening? No, she wasn't that type of girl. So she wasn't not listening. It was zoning out, spacing out, and things like that. So even though she came to us for depression, I said, we need to get this girl tested for ADHD. So long story short, gave mom a referral. We did I want to say regional center, but it wasn't regional center. Her medical doctor, so forth and so on. We got the referral to do testing at school, and lo and behold, this young girl, it wasn't depression, it was ADHD. And so basically I changed my treatment plan. And as we shifted the treatment plan from depression to ADHD, the depression went away. Because she felt better about herself. We were able to identify what the real issue was and begin to get her help to deal with the ADHD, which then boosted the confidence, which then boosted the self-esteem. And we actually even got her into boxing. The confidence went through the roof, depression went away. So conversely, this same thing happens all the time. Where another story of working with a young kid, and I remember this family. I would go to the house. This kid went to a school in Fontana. And I want to say he was 7 years old. Yeah, about 7. Mom, dad, grandma lived in the home, and for all intents and purposes, seemed like a very nice family. But when I tell you this kid would not sit down and do his homework, would not go to school, would always get in trouble, to the point where dad would have to drag him out of the car, kicking and screaming, and wouldn't sit still in class, running out of class, and all of these things. The parents, when they came to me, were contemplating medication. And this was a Hispanic kid, was contemplating medication. Okay, well, let me work with him for a while. Here's what I'm getting at. Long story short, I worked with this family for approximately 4 months. The kid didn't have ADHD at all. Now, when we look at the behavior, when we look at the hyperactivity, when we look at, like I said, the aggression, not wanting to sit down and do homework, couldn't pay attention, so forth and so on. So here's what happened. For that 4 months, me and that kid played Uno, checkers, other games, and so forth. Here's where the change came from. The change from me working with the family on how to deal with the behaviors, how to deal with the angry or emotional outbursts, how to deal with the behavior. And once the family and the parents got the behaviors under control, the symptoms of ADHD went away. So this is why I say, is it ADHD or not? Now, when we talk about some of the causes of ADHD, there's some myths. And I'm going to get into it just real briefly. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because I want to get to the heart of this, of my concern when it comes to this, especially dealing with kids in the school system, particularly Black boys. Now, here's some myths about ADHD and its causes. One of the things that does not cause ADHD is a kid eating too much sugars. Now, that's a difference between eating additives and preservatives and eating too much sugars. A kid eating too much sugar does not cause ADHD. What is called immunization shots does not cause ADHD. Allergies do not cause ADHD. Now, here's some other things that just does not cause ADHD. And I don't know about this one, but this is what the research says, is that parenting styles does not cause ADHD. However, parenting styles can create behaviors that look like ADHD. Here's why that's important. 80% of kids who are diagnosed with ADHD have genetic markers that create, if you will, or causes the disorder. The other 20% is environmental, if you will. Now, here's why this is important to understand. When we are ruling out or ruling in ADHD, we got to be very careful. So if we check all of these boxes and our kid does not match the causes of, or how could I put it? If what we know to be facts about ADHD and its causes, if your kid doesn't meet that, now we got another issue. And I'm telling you, most of the kids that come to therapy does not meet the clinical diagnosis. And what I mean by clinical, I mean biological or genetic makeup of ADHD. Here's what I find. And this is where we need to have our discussion. And here's where we need to have our discussion. Is it ADHD or not? Is that most of the kids that come to me, there are extenuating circumstances that create behavior that mimic and look like ADHD. And oftentimes, because of lack of resources, lack of knowledge, lazy parenting, inattentive parenting, and other social factors, maybe parents have to work so they can't attend to their kids, maybe single parent homes, whatever the causes, there's behaviors that are created that where things look like they have ADHD, and most of the times it's not. One of the biggest ones is trauma. A trauma response in children can very well look like ADHD. Some kids just have energy. But if not managed and or learning behavioral skills and checked, then the behaviors look like ADHD. The problem is this boils over into the school system. Here's another thing. And even though I love talking about video games don't create or cause ADHD, but the misuse of it creates behaviors that look like ADHD. So now let's talk about this. Let's get to the where I really want to go. But I thought it was important to break down ADHD, the causes of it, what it looks like, to have this conversation. Now, the question becomes, is it ADHD or not? Now, recently, I'll say it this way. One of the things that I see is parents bring their child, and like I said before, when I'm doing an assessment, I'm assessing everything. I'm observing the child. And now, let me say this real quick, and I didn't say it earlier. In order for a child to be diagnosed with ADHD, the symptoms have to be present in more than one environment. If they're only acting out in school, but they're fine at home and they're fine in public, they don't meet the criteria for ADHD. So one of the things I'm paying attention to is when a child comes into my office, and I don't have a lot of rules per se. Sometimes I get anxiety when they start touching my stuff because, I'm particular about my stuff. I got nice things, but okay. But one of the things I'm paying attention to, can this child sit still? I'm looking at the boundaries when it comes to the parents or the parent and the child. I'm looking at mom's interaction or dad's interaction with the kids. And I'm questioning and I'm getting background from mom, dad, or whoever, and I'm getting all of this information, and then I come up with an assessment. What I can tell you is, greater than not, most oftentimes, it is not a clinical diagnosis of ADHD. It is something else. What do I mean by that? One of the things as therapists is we rule things out. Meaning, when you come to us, we don't go looking for things to say, oh, you got this, you got that. One of the things is we have to follow a criteria, right? We have to follow the symptoms. So one of the things is, if it doesn't match something, then we rule it out. Nope, it's not that. Nope, it's not that. Here's the things that I see that kids, where their behaviors look like ADHD, and oftentimes it's not. Yet again, what I said, this is so important, because if we're treating the wrong thing, then it's not going to be helpful. I see kids who, whatever their conditions are, there's some trauma. There's I would say, an unstable environment. Oftentimes there's absent or inattentive parents, meaning parents aren't in the home. And I don't necessarily mean not living there, but maybe they got to work. Maybe there's a single parent household, so mom has to work often. There's the too much reliance on other things to socialize kids. Ergo, video games, TV, screen time, the lack of importance on academics, the lack of boundaries. This is a huge one. I see oftentimes when I'm sitting and observing the parents, and those who know me, sometimes I wonder why people come back, because when I look at them, I keep a straight face, and they probably looking at me like, what this man thinking? But I'm observing the boundaries between the parent and the kids. And oftentimes what I see is that there are no clear boundaries when it comes to who's the adult and who's the child in the relationship. So if there's a lack of boundaries here in my office, and then as I question things, there's a lack of boundaries in the home. So what happens is, because there's a lack of boundaries here, there's a lack of boundaries most likely elsewhere, what do you think's going to happen when they go to school? And when behaviors go unchecked at home, then it's going to be hard for a stranger to check them at school. Here's a huge one. Oftentimes, I see kids who have ADHD-like behaviors struggle academically, particularly with reading. Here's the thing. I see a lot of kids, because parents don't put value on reading. That might be a little harsh, but I believe it. But for whatever reason, put value on other things. And so what happens is, because academics is sometimes lower on the priority list, kids can't function in an environment like a school environment where there's structure. You have to practice patience. You have to be focused. You have to follow instructions. You have to pay attention. You have to follow along. But if I don't do any of that in my natural environment, how do I transition to school? So what happens is, oftentimes what I see, and this is how I explain it to parents, there's a systematic problem. And so I don't tell parents that they're the problem, even though we could argue that point, but there's a systematic problem. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes, when it comes to children, their symptoms of any disorder, whether it's ADHD, trauma, anxiety, depression, oftentimes their symptoms are a result of their system. Their family, their mother, their father, their grandparents, the neighborhood, the house. Is the house chaotic? I've literally had clients where parents will bring kids and say, hey, they're this, that, and the third. And then I may step out and the parents is cussing them out in the parking lot. But then the kids are coming being treated for depression, anxiety, or ADHD. Make that make sense? Now, here's what I'm getting at. When the system is broken, it's going to create symptoms. It's going to have adverse effects. And we could do a whole show on trauma and ADHD. Because when we look at, and I use trauma, the term trauma in the broad sense, is the home chaotic? Is the home stable? Is there a lot of fighting? Is the kid getting enough sleep? Is there a routine in place? Are there boundaries in place? Are there expectations? What's your child's stress factor? We often talk about, for a lot of kids, some kids may not have a sound breakfast. Some kids may not even had a good dinner. Some kids may have even been up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning and then have to turn around and go to school. What kind of stress is your child under? Oftentimes, we don't believe that children are under stress. But we're talking about there are psychological, physical stressors that can create behaviors that look like ADHD. Emotional well-being, so forth. Now, what happens is, when people come to me, oftentimes what I tell parents before we even begin to consider medication is that not only is your child in treatment, you're in treatment. Your system is in treatment. And if your system is not going to change, then your kid's not going to get better. And so what happens is, like I told you about the story of the kid before, that I just played Uno and went and kicked the ball around and all this other stuff. When his ADHD symptoms went away, it was because I treated the system. The parent, the mother, the dad, the grandmother, the live-in grandmother. Here's the other thing. When we talk about behavioral interventions, and I'll get into some solutions in a minute. But the interventions that were applied were more behavioral than they were psychological. But it was setting boundaries. It was coaching parents and parenting support. It was creating standards. It was creating boundaries. It was creating expectations. It was dealing with explosive behaviors and how to deal with explosive behaviors. And when we dealt with the system and dealt with the parent's mindset, the ADHD symptoms went away. And those are just a couple of examples. So what I'm asking is it ADHD or not? Now, we're back in school, and I know some kids, maybe it's a carryover from last school year. And we're at a point where, you know, I encourage parents to get a hold of this early in the school year. But before we go around throwing around this term of ADHD, which to me, I think to a degree is a cop-out because it's much bigger than that in a lot of cases, then we got to really figure this out. I think a lot of parents are too often too ready to, and I know in the Black community, we honor independence. So we're too quick to release our children to their sense of independence, and we're not finished raising them yet. So, is it ADHD or not? Here's what I'm challenging those of you who struggle with this and have young children, boys particularly, you know, that have been labeled as ADHD or whatever it may be. Here's where I'm challenging you. Is you're going to have to do a full assessment, or maybe come in or find someone, do a full assessment of your system. Is your system creating behaviors that look like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? Now, here's some things that I would suggest that you do. There's several things. So if we're at a point where you feel like you need outside intervention in terms of a therapist or whatever, one of the things that I would suggest is not only with therapy, is that you seek a therapist that deals with or has an expertise in behavioral therapy. What do I mean by that? So as a psychotherapist, you know, we deal with the emotions and things like that. But there's another aspect to the field where there's people who specialize in dealing with behaviors. Fortunately, I have experience and knowledge and so forth in both, where not only is this behavioral therapist is going to create behavior interventions to help modify and shape behaviors, they're also going to work and coach you on your behaviors. They're also going to help you and coach you through your parenting skills and setting boundaries, and also you dealing with anything emotional that creates conflict in terms of how do you deal with your children. Parents who are weak in boundaries, parents who struggle to parent, oftentimes have their own psychological and emotional issues that get in the way of effective parenting. That's a whole nother show in and of itself. So here's a few things that I suggest. So one is, if you feel like you need outside help, find someone that can not only do psychotherapy, but can help assist you with behavioral interventions. And then here's the other thing. If you need parenting classes, take them. And here's what I mean by that. There's different types of parenting classes, and there's parenting classes for different age groups, but learning how to address specific behaviors when it comes to kids, you could find that in parenting classes. Here's the other thing. Learning to set boundaries. What is your environment? What is your child to parent relationship? Are there some boundaries that have been blurred? I worked with a family where the parent and the child were on the same level. And I see that all the time. There's no clear boundaries of who's in charge. If you as a parent need to get your ADHD treated, find help. If you as a parent who suffering through PTSD, other traumas, anxiety, depression, domestic violence, relationship issues, whatever it may be, you get help. Believe it or not, your issues trickle down to your child's issues. And when we talk about different behavioral skills and all those things, this show ain't for that, but you can learn those in these settings. So the big question is it ADHD or not? I hope this session, or I hope this podcast for today was helpful, because too often we are being misdiagnosed, and the interventions and the treatment doesn't match what the diagnosis is. So therefore, we continue to see, we struggle to see progress. And I have tons and tons of stories of kids that I've worked with where when the environment got better and the parents did things differently, the child got better. Now, you cannot send a kid to someone like me or a therapist and say, fix them, but then they go back into the same environment. It's not going to work. So, is it ADHD or not? We got to look at this holistically. We got to look at the entire system in order for this to be effective. So I hope that was helpful. I am your host, Jonathan Beauregard. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist or psychotherapist. Be on the lookout for more things to come from Beauregard Therapy. We're growing fast. We're going to be venturing into new things very quickly. I want to thank you for your continued support. And yet again, you can reach me at beauregardtherapy.com. You could also listen to this podcast on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as Anchor. Yet again, this has been Jonathan Beauregard. Have a good night. Enjoy your Sunday.